Climate change did not announce its arrival with a single disaster or a single year of destruction, but its presence is now unmistakable, written into the air, the oceans, and the weather patterns that once gave humanity a sense of rhythm and predictability. Because what was once described as a future threat has become a daily reality for millions of people whose lives are being reshaped by forces larger than borders, governments, or generations. And nowhere is this more evident than in the growing intensity of extreme weather events that are no longer anomalies, but signals of a planet under strain. For decades, climate change was framed as a distant possibility, something to be debated, modeled, and postponed. But the physical world does not operate on political timelines. And as global temperatures rise, the Earth's systems respond with increasing volatility, storing more heat in the atmosphere and oceans, altering rainfall patterns, intensifying storms, and destabilizing ecosystems that evolved under far more stable conditions, creating a cascade of consequences that are now unfolding in real time. In southern Africa, this reality arrived with devastating force when torrential rains triggered catastrophic flooding across multiple regions, overwhelming rivers, dams, and drainage systems, sweeping away homes, schools, and entire neighborhoods, killing hundreds of people and displacing more than 1 million, many of whom had little warning and even fewer resources to recover. As families fled, rising waters carrying children, food, and fragments of their lives, while infrastructure that once connected communities vanished beneath mud and debris. In the aftermath, scientists moved quickly to understand what had happened, and their findings were stark, showing that human-caused climate change had significantly increased the intensity of the rainfall, making the floods far more destructive than they would have been in a pre-industrial climate. And while floods have always occurred, the probability and severity of this event were amplified by a warmer atmosphere capable of holding more moisture and releasing it with devastating efficiency. For those living through the disaster, the science mattered less than survival. As emergency shelters filled beyond capacity, clean water became scarce. Disease risks rose, and livelihoods built over generations were erased in days, illustrating how climate change does not simply damage environments, but destabilizes societies, pushing already vulnerable populations closer to the edge, and transforming environmental shocks into humanitarian crises. These floods were not isolated, nor were they unexpected to those studying global climate trends, as similar patterns have emerged across continents, from record-breaking rainfall in Asia to historic flooding in Europe. From prolonged droughts in the Horn of Africa to intensifying hurricanes in the Atlantic, each event different in geography but connected by the same underlying driver, a planet warming faster than human systems can adapt. Extreme weather now follows a troubling pattern where disasters arrive more frequently, recovery periods shrink, and communities barely rebuild before the next crisis strikes, creating a state of perpetual vulnerability that drains resources, erodes resilience, and leaves little room for long-term planning, as governments are forced into constant emergency response rather than prevention and adaptation. The burden of these disasters is not evenly shared, as climate change exposes and magnifies global inequality, striking hardest in regions with limited infrastructure, fragile governance, and fewer financial resources, even though these regions have contributed the least to global greenhouse gas emissions, creating a moral imbalance at the heart of the climate crisis, where those least responsible bear the greatest cost. In wealthier nations, extreme weather disrupts economies, supply chains, and daily life, but safety nets often soften the blow, while in poorer regions, the same events can push millions into poverty, displacement, and long-term instability, increasing migration pressures and fueling conflict over dwindling resources such as water, arable land, and food security. Climate change also reshapes the global economy in subtle but profound ways. As floods destroy crops, disrupt trade routes, and inflate food prices, sending ripples through international markets, making basic necessities less affordable far beyond the regions directly affected, and reinforcing the reality that climate impacts do not respect borders, and that local disasters can quickly become global concerns. As extreme weather accelerates, scientists warn that the Earth is approaching thresholds beyond which changes may become irreversible, as melting ice sheets raise sea levels, warming oceans weaken natural carbon sinks, and deforestation reduces the planet's ability to regulate its own climate, creating feedback loops that accelerate warming even further, narrowing the window for meaningful intervention. Yet, despite mounting evidence, global responses remain fragmented and uneven, shaped by political cycles, economic interests, and competing priorities, as nations struggle to balance short-term growth with long-term survival, and as climate policy becomes entangled in ideological conflict rather than treated as a shared human challenge requiring collective action. Public perception of climate change is also shaped by distance, as those not immediately affected by disasters may view them as tragic but isolated events rather than symptoms of a systemic crisis, allowing urgency to fade between headlines, even as the frequency and severity of disasters continue to rise. Media coverage, while extensive, often struggles to convey the cumulative nature of climate impacts, focusing on individual events rather than the broader pattern, making it harder for audiences to grasp the scale of transformation underway and reinforcing a cycle where attention spikes during catastrophe and dissipates during recovery, even though recovery itself is increasingly incomplete. For communities on the front lines, climate change is not an abstract debate but a lived experience marked by loss, adaptation, and uncertainty. As farmers face unpredictable seasons, coastal communities confront rising seas, and urban populations endure heat waves that strain power grids and public health systems, revealing how deeply climate stability is woven into every aspect of modern life. Extreme heat alone has emerged as one of the deadliest climate impacts, silently killing thousands each year, overwhelming hospitals, and exacerbating existing health conditions, particularly among the elderly, the poor, and those without access to cooling or adequate housing, demonstrating that climate change can be lethal even without dramatic visuals of storms or floods. The psychological toll of climate disasters is also growing, as survivors experience trauma, anxiety, and a sense of permanent insecurity, knowing that rebuilding may offer only temporary relief before the next event, contributing to what experts describe as climate grief and climate anxiety, emotions increasingly common across generations. Children growing up in this era inherit not only a changing planet, but a future defined by uncertainty. As education is disrupted by disasters, communities are displaced, and the idea of stability itself becomes fragile, raising profound questions about responsibility, justice, and the kind of world being passed forward. Despite these challenges, the climate crisis is not solely a story of loss, but also one of resilience, innovation, and adaptation as communities develop early warning systems, climate-resilient infrastructure, and sustainable practices designed to reduce risk and build long-term stability, demonstrating that while the impacts are severe, the future is not predetermined. Technological advances in renewable energy, climate modeling, and disaster prediction offer powerful tools, but their effectiveness depends on political will, international cooperation, and equitable distribution, as solutions concentrated in a few regions will not be enough to address a crisis that is fundamentally global. The floods in southern Africa stand as a stark reminder that climate change is not unfolding in distant projections, but in real places, at real moments, with consequences measured in lives lost, communities displaced, and futures altered, and that each disaster carries a message that grows harder to ignore, that the climate system humanity depends on is being pushed beyond its limits. The question now facing the world is not whether climate change is happening, but whether societies will continue to respond reactively, counting the cost after each catastrophe, or shift toward prevention, resilience, and collective action that recognizes climate stability as essential to global security, economic prosperity, and human dignity. As extreme weather becomes the new normal, the choices made today will determine whether future generations inherit a planet defined by constant crisis or one where the worst impacts were confronted with urgency and cooperation. Because climate change is not a distant enemy, but a present force shaping lives now, demanding not just awareness, but action before the next disaster arrives.